genuinely appreciate it. I wrote a bunch of fantasy world building stories with their own unique characters, struggles, all set in this fantasy world of a carton. And I figured I'd put it up on YouTube with some art and music and kind of see what happens. This is part 2 of 3 for the Long March to the Clearwater Spears. I hope you enjoyed part 1, and if you haven't, I'm sorry. And if you haven't also, why are you here? But hey, thank you for coming regardless. This story is about a mercenary army commissioned to support a falling nation against a rising warlord. The only problem is that falling nation is a great distance away, and that mercenary army has to cross that distance in a very short period of time in order to prevent the fall of such nation. This one should be a little bit interesting. Got some really great battles, some incredible amount of time that I spent putting together the sound integrations and everything like that. And some really good struggles and things, and hopefully some good surprises and everything like that. So I hope you really enjoy it, as ever. And if you're curious about any of the artists, stick around to the end, and I will have a proper credit scene for them where I go into who they are, where you can find them, and some little bits about them, that sort of stuff. And if you like my content, please like, comment, subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. That's the only thing that's going to really help grow my channel. And if you have anything to say, feel free to drop a comment down below and tell me, what you think, what you like, what you don't like. I'm certainly always open to criticism. And yeah, without further ado, to the story.
Another day passed. The hills had already begun to rise on the plains, while worn-down mountains beckoned from the horizon. The border between Carul and Raver was fast approaching. Small thickets of trees began to appear above the tall grass. They cut down the prevailing wind as a fine and continuous drizzle rained down from the sky. Soldiers donned cloaks and shivered against the gaining cold. Scattered hills offered some welcome variation, breaking up the endless sea of flat that marked the yellowed plains. Here and there they stood with varying character above the golden grass. Some sat in large gaining slopes, while others gathered in small huddles. The full of the Clearwater spears marched along the bases of them, working the fastest and most direct path they could manage. The marshal continued to lead on foot, with pack, spear, and shield. He was tired and damp like all the rest of his troops. Eyes stood focused on the westward horizon. They moved along the bottom of a grand hill, bearing a small thicket of trees at the top of it. They were 2 days from Raver, and still almost 4 from the capital city of Bended Thorn. Thoughts were on the march. Ever the tiring and blasted march. 3 long clarion blasts were heard from the scouting horses in front. It was a call for reinforcements. Lano slowed his gait as confusion spread across his face. The scouting parties weren't supposed to engage unless an ally was under attack. There was only one force they'd been paid to protect. What was Raver doing this far east? Hannah drew her horse forward at a canter just ahead of the line, taking over the lead space that Lana would normally have ridden. She went forward to try and get a better view of what could be seen. The rain stopped suddenly, but the clouds were still gray. For a moment, there was only the 3 echoing blasts, the call for forward reinforcements. A strange and unnatural silence seemed to fill the air around them. Something was wrong. Lano instinctively turned his head to the surrounding area cautiously, as a feeling of apprehension enveloped him. Carried on the air, barely heard, but unmistakable, he heard a voice singing. Then another horn sounded from the scouting horses north of them, the worst of relayed messages. One long clarion call of warning. Suddenly, a firebolt tore from the hilltop beside them. It flew towards Hannah, alone on her horse. The marshal watched with a sickening sense of terror as it struck the ground beneath her and sent her flying into the air. Mages! A voice yelled down the line. 2 voices, 3, more rose up suddenly in loud discordant hum. Unmistakable for what it was. The combined work of the singers of spells. It rose so strongly that it was impossible to ignore. The ground became alive under the feet of his army. A great rumbling beneath cast flashes of doubt into his soldiers' faces. The land began to rise beneath them, as great mounds of dirt grew quickly up from the flats of the plains. His soldiers tripped and rolled over shield and spear, as a 3-stride tall wall of dirt shoved them back towards the hill. It ran the forward length of his army, far enough back that the marshal couldn't see the end of it. With a sinking sense of dread, Lano remembered the threat spat by the Crescent cavalrymen about Thardis. He saw how the snaking mound boxed his army in against the hill. Then the arrows began to fall from the hilltop. A large bolt of fire joined with them and smashed his army in a great explosion. All within its circle of death were blasted into the air. Lano startled, but recovered quickly. His mind began to race. Unbidden, his army was already beginning to put together shield walls against the attack. He took in the ambush, his injured second, the dirt bulwark, the arrows, and the mage fire. It was clear instinctively that the attackers wanted to attempt an assault on the hill. It was also clear to him that was the absolute last thing he should do. He scanned the open lands away from the hill, looking for an alternative option. In a moment, they landed on a gathering of hills, perhaps 3 leagues off. Almond! The marshal barked to the orderly beside him. Marshal! He pointed off to the southwest. Do you see those far hills? Yes, Marshal. He gestured the horn at his chest. 3 long horn blasts. Take the banner, lead the army there, and reinforce it. The orderly hesitated, grimaced, but at last nodded. Aye, Marshal. He blew the 3 long horn blasts of forward march and lifted up the banner of the Clearwater spears so that all could see. The call ran through the ranks. Lano ditched his pack as he cast an eye to his second, some 40 or 50 strides away from him. The mount she had ridden lay on its side, unmoving, clearly dead, but it also hid whether the same was true for her. The marshal grabbed a nearby horse, mounted in a blink, and rode at a gallop out towards her. With tromping hooves, he shot through the forward gap of the line, as horns continued to glare behind him. He closed the distance between him and her quickly. Lano dismounted smoothly from his horse as he drew near, boots striking the ground. The body of the dead horse rested on top of his second's leg as she shifted and struggled against it. In an apprehensive flash, he looked her over. He noted how she was only using one arm, the other one limp at her side. There were blackened burns along her exposed arm and up her jaw. As Lano drew up in front of her, she turned to him with recognition in her eyes. In some unbelievable way, there was a grin on her face. Relief flooded over him. I think my leg's broken, she grimaced. Lano turned his attention to it, placing a careful hand on the length of lower armor caught underneath the horse's corpse. He felt the unnatural give as Hannah cried out in pain. Yep, it's broken. The marshal cast his head behind him. Healer! He barked over the metal in chaos. He turned back to his second with a shining din of urgency. Help will be on the way. Does anything else feel worse? She snorted at him. I'm not some damn child crying for her wet nurse. Things hurt, but I'll manage. I have to leave. I need to get our troops away from that hill. She acknowledged his words with a nod. Just flattered you came for me first, she said with a grin. Does that mean you're in love? Lano scoffed. Fuck off, you clever harridan. He mounted his horse quickly and tore back to the ambush with shield raised. That isn't a no! He heard Hannah cry out from behind him. The marshal couldn't help but grin and realized silently how much it helped in that moment. Infantry rushed past him on foot, heading towards the far hills, but their going was slower than expected as he came under fire. A squad diverged with a healer among them, heading towards his wounded second in command. The marshal turned to the next task at hand. Ever the task. He rode back to the barrier holding the bulk of his army in the thick of the ambush. The 3 long bursts of forward movement were being culled, but much of his army was barely moving. The arrows fell. Another firebolt blasted down an explosion of force, and his people died. As lengths of infantry marched past him to the far hills, he drove into them, pressing through the breach, between the hill and halting column of dirt, trapping them in. The movement of bodies away slowed his progress inward. He pressed through crowds of shields, spears, and bows, metal clinking and people screaming. Stride by stride, he pushed through the chaos, endeavoring to belt his voice above it. He swung his spear in the air and pointed the way out. "Ford out, follow!" The marshal kept moving back down the line doggedly as the horns blared the retreat. His horse's hooves trod upon the dead, laying motionless, burned and mutilated. His heart jolted towards the wounded, crying out in pain, trying to flee and stuck in the quagmire of mud and rain. He pushed the wrenching feeling aside. There'd be time for it. "The wounded, Marshal!" Dennis, his 4th lieutenant, cried, barely within earshot. He had to get his army away from the hill. If he didn't, the ranks of wounded would only grow. Startling regret coursed through his chest, and raging eyes turned towards the hilltop where the enemy assaulted them. "Leave them! We'll come back! Ford out, follow!" He barked viciously. A gap opened up for him unexpectedly. Something else was blocking his troops' forward escape beyond the simple exhaustion. The marshal looked on in shock as it appeared Fanner, his 5th lieutenant, had organized his squad into a shield wall and was trying to mount an assault on the hill. Lano practically leapt from his horse in a fury. "Do you hear the horns? Forward retreat!" he screamed at the lieutenant as he pulled the man's face directly in front of him. The eyes that turned back at him were wild and full of unnatural rage. Fanner shoved back at the marshal. "Those bastards killed our own! I'll make them pay!" Lano stared at him incredulously, hearing the song and reading the insane malaise for what it was. A hard enchantment, the mind work of a foul mage. Rage stirred unnaturally within him. Lano struck Fanner in the gut and slapped him across the face. "Cover your ears and listen to my orders, you enchanted fool!" Lano yelled. "Ford out, follow!" The lieutenant gasped, raised his sword, and the marshal struck him hard in the face, sending him to the ground. Under the song's work, he wanted to kill the soldier, but the mercenary leader fought it, focusing hard on the task of retreat. He stood his ground with shield upraised as the arrows continued to fall. "Get your senses back! There's no time for this!" At last, as Fanner stood up, he turned with downturned eyes of shame. The fever of rage seemed past. "Aye, Marshal," he said almost meekly as he turned away. The foolish assault ended, the squad turned, the blockage opened, and his remaining troops marched forward in retreat. Lano mounted his horse and tore back through the lines, rousing the exhausted onward. Another intermittent firebolt blasted down behind him, pounding into his diminishing army. An arrow whistled past his head, missing him by a breath. He ignored it and kept moving. Movement was the best way to keep him safe. His progress slowed as his soldiers bunched up against him. A projectile struck his raised shield, and another. His horse bucked as an arrow shot into his shoulder, but he righted it. "Ford out, follow!" He continued to bark in every direction, running his voice hoarse but making true progress. He was halfway through, nearing the end of the dirt bulwark the Thardan mages had raised from the ground. His soldiers to the rear of it were already pulling away from the hill, taking to the safety of the open plains. Sergeants and 2 of his lieutenants moved their squads away under fierce drumbeat. The whisper of a grin came to his face as the flood of infantry continued to move past him and away. His army was escaping. Then he turned as a firebolt flashed, beaming death upon him. In a reflexive blink, Lano leapt from his horse towards the 3-stride dirt barrier. An explosive burst of heat, carnage, and screaming. He was shoved against it. He gasped as the wind was knocked from his stomach. His head struck the raised ground. His ears rang and his head dazed as he fought to keep his awareness. He shook his head, seeing the world, but not recognizing the things in it. that one simple thought driving his every act. Keep moving. Lano grimaced, snorted, and rocked to his feet. The immediate space around him was suddenly clear. There were bodies and things and arrows still falling. He'd lost his spear, and the shield on his arm was a broken, burning mess. But he was alive. He could move, and he was pushing away. There were two bodies rushing alongside him, with great kite shields upraised, blocking the still falling arrows. He focused on his breath. He focused on his wavering legs. His ears began to stop ringing. His eyes began to recognize what they saw. He recognized his infantry doing their best to protect him. His left arm was bleeding behind the tatters of shield. He didn't know what else could be done. He couldn't feel anything. But he was alive, and he was walking away, fighting the days that hovered over his mind. Before long, he recovered. His eyes ran to the wounded as the ambush continued. He helped those to their feet that could walk. There weren't many. He swore his return to those that couldn't. More of his soldiers swarmed in to help those they could as the numbers around him rose to 10 or 15. Another arrow struck down a wounded soldier beside him. The end of the dirt wall, blocking them in, was only some 10 strides away. Then a great clamor blared from the sky. A solitary roar, unlike anything he'd ever heard. Instinctually, the mercenary marshal knew what it was. The battling cry of a wyvern. All heads turned to the hill for a moment, as a great flash of wings showed itself in the sky, bound to an even greater beast and rider. One soldier of Raver attacked the small gathering of trees and the soldiers at the top of the hill. The song stopped. The bolts of fire ceased. The arrows no longer fell. His army at last found its focus, and whatever energy they had left. Between the mounds of dirt blocking their retreat and their forward path of their escape, they at last formed up and broke into a fast march out. His army was clearing out away from the ambush and heading towards the far hills his orderly led them to. A soldier on horseback spotted him, and the 20 or so others as they cleared the long mound of dirt. He turned towards Lano at a gallop. "Marshal!" he cried, drawing near as he extended a hand down towards him. Lano hesitated on the offered hand as he turned to the wounded and righted soldiers behind him. "Get along, Marshal," a sergeant barked. "We'll have what's left, and you're no more good staying here." Still, he stood his ground as the fire within him continued to churn. "We're coming back!" he yelled. "By the dragon gods, I swear we are coming back to right this! I will be coming back to right this!" It seemed so suddenly quiet. The sergeant and a few of the soldiers gave exhausted grins. "We know, Marshal. Now get along. We'll be short behind you." Lano nodded, tossing his battered shield to the ground. He turned back to the cavalry and took his arm, lifting himself up on the back of his horse. With a yip and a strike, he was away. Horse and rider beat an even gallop across the long ocean of flat plains. He passed soldiers on foot, heading determinedly towards the hills in the distance, some 3 leagues away. The remnants of the yellowed plains and the land of Karul stretched before him. The marshal turned his attention back towards the hill as that solitary wyvern rider rose and churned and dove at the attackers. Firebolts rose up at him and arrows sought to take him down, but he dodged them in a deft aerial dance. It was something beautiful to behold. Whoever that warrior was, he was brave, stupid, and a true gift to Lano's troops. As the remnants of the Clearwater spears cleared away from the hill, the wyvern rider brought his mount high into the sky and flew off. The great beast glided overhead, going westward along the lines of his army. He wondered on the character of the army of Raven. He wondered on Roland, the Ironwood patron. The head of the line of fleeing soldiers fast approached on horseback, Amon leading them dutifully well with banner held high and tight to the side of his horse. Behind him he could still hear the command of the 3 horn blasts, but the heart of the skirmish was over. The independent squads of healthy, and wary soldiers saluted the marshal as he passed them. Between an improvised sled, 4 soldiers dragged Hannah across the open plains. She raised a muddied arm up to him as he passed. The shadow of a grin came to the mercenary marshal's face. His second was safe. His troops had gotten away, and they would live to fight another day. As they drew to the head of the soldiers, Lano signaled to the cavalryman to let him dismount. He drew himself up beside the young orderly and matched pace with him. The excitement within him subsided as the true aches of the battle crept over his body. He felt so suddenly tired, but pressed himself into the march as their destination neared less than a league away. For a while they carried on in silence, but the young orderly too often cast a hesitant glance to the marshal walking beside him. It was clear he wanted to tell him something, or ask a question. It was also clear he was too afraid to ask. Lano snorted to break the quiet. "Say what's on your mind, Amund. I won't bite," he said. The orderly hesitated for a further moment, but nodded at last. "We could have taken them, Marshal. I know in my bones we could have destroyed them. Why did we flee?" "They had a reinforced position. Our ultimate goal is to reinforce Raver. Their goal was to clearly diminish our ability to do that. You can't ever give the enemy what they want. They're not gonna leave us alone. They're gonna harry us the whole time if we keep running." Lano turned an eye to the sky above, as the drizzle slowly gave way to proper rain. He turned an eye to the west and the vague glow of the sun, diffused behind the thick gray clouds. It was already getting dark. Night would be coming soon. There were things to be done before that happened, plans to be made, and soldiers to be gathered together. This wasn't over. There was a long day still, and maybe even a longer night ahead of them. He nodded acknowledgement to the young orderly. "I know. That's why we make sure the next time we meet, it's on our terms, and not theirs." Camp had been made at the far hills. The trenches had been dug, and a quarter of his remaining army had been moved to sentry duty. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the night settled in, it became time to return. The full might of the fall rains fell around them with almost the resonance of a dull roar. The marshal led a sortie of 500 soldiers to recover the wounded. His army held a 3-wide column with kite shields lifted in defensive postures, nestled between the lines of soldiers who had 4 emptied wagons pulled by horse. The near fullness of the dragon moon, an ever-trailing orphan, barely made an impression through the roiling dark clouds. Boots plunged almost to the ankle as his troops led emptied wagons through the gaining mud. Lano eyed the hill apprehensively as it slowly came into view through the darkness. His ranging scouts had verified the hill clear of attackers, but that hardly served to settle the wariness with which he approached it. Chain echoed against steel as the detachment of his army marched forward at an even cadence. The marshal was tired. Even as his body shivered against the cold rain, he would have given his left hand to lay down in the mud and sleep. His eyes roved to the open plains, where even now his scouts ran their patrols in circles a league beyond where they stood. The task ever remained. There would be time to sleep when he was dead. Eidolon's turn had not come quite yet. They approached the hill. The long ridge of magically risen dirt still stood, along with the castaway relics of the encounter. Broken shields and shattered spears lay abandoned on the ground, beside the mutilated carcasses of horses and soldiers. But at the mouth of that forsaken trap, 2 long wooden pikes stood where they hadn't before. A bitter grimace rose to Lano's face with a shudder. Fire rose in his chest, casting away his nagging exhaustion. One of the soldiers beside the marshal gasped. Something had changed on the remains of the battlefield, and not for the better. Impaled upon the sharp points of those wooden pikes were the severed heads of 2 of his soldiers. Lano called a halt, sending 100 infantry and his archers to the hill to reinforce the position. Only then did he allow those who remained to press forward. Soldiers hummed glowshard lanterns to life, bringing soft light to the darkness. Those at the base moved forward earnestly as the wagons followed close behind them. The carnage only rose as his troops moved into the battered space of conflict. There were 10 pikes, 20, 30, more than mattered counting. Atop each sat the head of one of his soldiers, with bloodied face and empty, lifeless eyes. Their decapitated corpses laid strewn about the ground as the rain continued to fall. As his mercenary detachment moved through the long row of mud and blood, no figure stirred, and not one voice cried out to them. Everything was rain and silence and death. A dark pale stole into the marshal's heart as he began to wonder how many wounded he would be recovering. These were his troops. Lano chafed silently. He'd failed them. "Marshal!" a soldier cried from some 10 strides in front of him. "We have a survivor!" Lano jumped from his tired thoughts and dashed forward to the voice of his waiting infantryman. Nestled up against the great dirt ridge and buried between 2 other dead soldiers, a figure stirred, clutching at his side. "Healer!" another soldier cried out as another one pushed forward to wrap a cloak around his wounded comrade. Soaked and bloodied, with eyes full of shock, the man began to speak. "You came. I knew you would. I couldn't save them. I couldn't save them. I'm sorry." "What happened here?" Lano barked, though it seemed plain enough. "Not long after you left, they came down the hill," he said, trembling. "They laughed and mocked us the whole time. They went through everyone they could find and slaughtered them." The marshal turned his head down the line as the grimace on his face deepened. Glowshard lanterns shined as little quaking beads of light down the line. Wherever their light was cast, they seemed to illuminate more of the dead. But the bodies hadn't been left alone. It was clear enough to see that many had been purposely disfigured with blade or club. "You see it all, don't you, Marshal?" the wounded soldier whimpered. "You've seen what they did. Why would they do this? We couldn't fight. There were so many that I couldn't save. So few. So few." "Found a few others here, Marshal," another soldier further down declared. "I'm not sure how many more survivors we're going to find, though." "Healer!" another voice cried out. In the darkness, he heard the curses of his other troops, along with roaring bursts of anguish. All Lano could see were those eyes, the pleading eyes staring up at him. "I heard some begging for their lives," the man continued. "I heard them. They just laughed. Those Thard and Dong farming wretches just laughed as they took knives to throats and it bashed in their faces." Lano nodded solemnly. "I'm sorry," he replied, "but at least we're here now." The soldier shivered back into the mud at the edge of tears, but he held them back. He sat there as the rain continued to fall, motionless. 2 of his infantry approached and lifted the wounded man to one of the wagons. Lano stared silently at him as fire continued to rise in his chest. His troops took to the grisly task of gathering the dead. They tore down the pikes and pulled the heads of their comrades off of them. The bodies were thrown into the empty carts, while the one put aside for the wounded remained painfully spacious. In all, only 14 survivors would be found among the hundreds lost. The marshal helped where he could. and with each mutilated corpse cast into a wagon, the anger within him only rose. He knew why Thardus did this. The bastards had meant to incite fear in his army and his troops. They meant to give them reason to turn around and head back east. How did the cause of coin stand up against this horrible march and the savagery of the army they faced? His exhaustion had disappeared in the face of what stood before him. This act of added butchery had the opposite effect. There would be retribution, and the sooner he did it, the better. No matter his plain ache, cold, and exhaustion, his own kind of violence would not wait until the morning. Their scouting horses were abroad, and enough of his troops were healthy. They were going hunting. "Our scouts will find them!" he barked. "They've started something, and by rancor, we will be the ones to end it!" His able-bodied troops only nodded as they continued to work. Though there was little intensity in their actions, they knew the marshal meant it. Their evening had only begun. And so it was deeper in the night, but still safely before the dawn. The hard rains continued to fall around them, never seen in the darkness, but deeply felt. The Thardan soldiers had moved 5 leagues away, to the far side of another hill, but his ranging scouts, led by Urja, had spied their movement. Lano knelt in the tall grass of the open plains, with keen attention towards it. Less than a few hundred strides in front of them, it stood like a black monolith on the edge of what could be seen, barely discernible against the blue char-gray of the darkness. Revenge rang like a clarion call in his mind. His body shivered against the sodden cold rain, but the fire within him burned tempered hot. At his back were 200 of his best soldiers, the healthiest and the angriest. All shared in the same vicious purpose. Caked in mud, with shields and sword, they worked silently across the open space, staying close. They moved with a determined sense of urgency, working a wide circle to their destination, intent on approaching from an unexpected direction. They closed the distance quickly, 100 strides, 200. Lano slid the shield to his back and dropped to the ground as his raiding party followed suit. They lay there silently as he eyed the farther hill apprehensively. It was too far away to know what dangers it held, but too perfect to doubt it would be reinforced. He turned to Iro, his 3rd lieutenant, close at his left. "Half to the hill. Blow the horn when you take it. We have the camp." "Aye, Marshal," the man whispered with a malevolent grin. "Gonna wreck those stone-humping bastards." Iro stood up and gestured with his hands as half of his party slid back into the darkness. The remaining soldiers closed ranks, coming in close, so as not to be lost in the night. These drills had been planned and practiced to be a practical reflex. At the head of his spear tip, Lano led the remaining 4 in a crawl through the tall grass, as the cold rain continued to fall upon them. Stride by patient stride they gained ground, as the first edges of a camp revealed itself. A pair of foreign soldiers moved on pacing legs, as the barely seen shadows of horses nickered and stomped at the mud. Lano raised a hand up to halt, and the command passed silently through the ranks. Their Thardan opponents were smart. They burned no fires to declare their presence. Still, it wouldn't be enough to save them. His thoroughly drilled scouts had been right. They were there, as close as they dared to come, within a painfully seductive distance to enact their violent plan. But they had to wait on his 3rd lieutenant's horn. Lano's heart thundered in his chest in a mix of excitement and fear. Whatever the outcome, this was the task laid before him. The rain continued to fall in darkness. The cold wetness bled into the depths of his core as his body began to shiver. The Thardan soldiers paced as an open target, coldly unaware of the fate that awaited them. Lano gripped tensely at the handle of his sword, running what needed to be done in his mind as he slid his hand back. He whispered a prayer to the dragon god Rancor as the moments ticked painfully by, and he waited. Then, as the edges of dawn neared, a 3 long and 2 short horn blasts blared from the hilltop. Iero had done the task given him. His soldiers jumped to their feet, and with a gathered war cry, they charged. Lano lifted his shield and hefted his sword as his feet carried him to the startled Thardan soldier. The enemy turned to him, lifting his shield to block too slowly. The marshal knocked it away and plunged his blade deep into him. The man screamed and faltered. Lano charged past him, pushing hard towards the camp. The rear line would finish off the wounded. 50 troops ran in a determined jog with shields held forward. The first task placed at their feet clearly understood. Kill those disgusting wielders of magic. They rushed past the first rows of tents as a wealth of activity began to draw around them. The camp was coming to life as Thardis' own warning horns gave its first call. Curdled screams began to rise with the alarm. The jangling beat of weapon to weapon radiated out along the camp. The soldiers working around Lano hooped and hollered in a great rising chorus. Raging retribution had come for these Thardan bastards. His infiltrators kept moving with eyes towards the inward camp. The spellcasters varied little from army to army. They always got softer treatment than the regular infantry, and their shelters were always just a little bit better. In the falling rain, Lano and those closest to him spied the telltales they had sought. 4 tents, taller than the others, sat in their own circle on higher ground. On a stunted flagstaff, a pennant billowed in the wind. As they fast approached, a robed figure dashed from one of the tents. He hesitated in the falling rain and turned to the charging invaders. Lano dove into him, plunging his blade into the mage's stomach. The figure gasped as he knocked him to the ground and made quick work of him with fists and steel. Off to his right, he heard a quick gathering of song. An orb flew into the air, casting the landscape around them in a bright, clear light. His soldiers' assault burst into clarity for some stark moments before his troops fell upon the song wielder and brought her down. It was the only spell they would get off, and it was too late to matter. The Thardan soldiers sought to form a defense in the midst of their attack. The enemy hastily lifted sword and shield, trying to put together a defensive formation as a second detachment of soldiers charged down from the hill behind them. The enemy formation put up a small share of resistance, rushing to get shield forward behind them. But caught between the dual assault of his soldiers, they were slaughtered. His troops worked back through the camp, going from tent to tent and killing the half-equipped Thardan soldiers that uselessly sought to fight them. There were those who sought to flee, and his soldiers chased them down. In time, the clang of steel to steel settled down into a whisper. Lano stood in the darkness of the fall rains, with bloodied sword and shield, as the horns of the Clearwater spears blared. Vengeance was his for this moment, but the task was far from done, and he knew it. Still, as the army raised a loud cheer of victory, he joined them. He lost himself in that moment among his troops as he lifted his voice to the darkened sky. Dawn would be coming, and another day. There were still the casualties to be sorted. There was still the march. There was still the matter of supporting the Ironwood patron and Raver. Even as Lano felt relief in the moment, a darkened pale persisted within him. His soldiers' future was far from certain, and the responsibility of it fell on him. It was the morning of that same day. The sun was up at his army's camp as the fall rains fell along the edges of the land of Karul. Infantrymen, archers, and cavalry worked side by side to bury the dead, while scant few healers tended to their wounded. In all, 4 mages and a few hundred Thardan infantry had made casualties of almost half of his army. Cold rains from the west saturated the parched ground beneath them, already turning it into mud. Still, Lano stood beneath it, just outside the pavilion set up for the wounded. The wet and cold crept into his body, causing him to shiver. It was a small but nagging torment, one he felt that he deserved. He watched his handful of healers working through the full rows of injured soldiers, patching up lost arms where they could, and setting broken limbs. On occasion, a body would be carried away on a litter to the soldiers digging outside. He stood before the pallet, swaddling his second-in-command. A healer cleaned the dirt away from her wounds, worked to set her broken bones, and wrapped her injuries in fresh bandages. She was alive, a half-burnt mess of painfully awkward angles, but alive. He thanked the dragon gods for that. Still, her skin was pale, and the voice that spoke back to him lacked much of the bravado he was accustomed to. "So how do I look?" Hannah asked him in a voice far weaker than yesterday. "Still as beautiful as ever," he replied. "I know when you're lying, Lano." The marshal snorted. "Just some more scars to add to your tally, Hannah." Hannah cast her one uncovered eye out beyond the pavilion and into the pouring rain. "You're going to leave me, aren't you? And most of the wounded." He remained silent, knowing it was true, knowing it had to be true. Time had been the driving force behind Lano's decision, behind the path his army had taken. He had chosen the most direct route, the most predictable route to Raver, and he had not expected a serious battle until getting there. His own had died because of it, and fiery guilt roiled deep within his chest. He had to make something good of this. His unusually soft and searching eyes fell upon her with a grimace. She managed a weak grin. "I'm gonna live, Lano. Don't worry about that one. Do me a favor and don't make me feel like I'm the lucky one being stuck back here." She really did compliment him in the best way. Looking her over, the fire within him rose. The mercenary marshal clenched his hand into a fist. "I won't," he swore. He turned from the healer's pavilion and stormed into the sheets of falling rain. His mind raced. The question was how he would make something good of it, and he didn't know, but it didn't matter. He was going to figure that out. "Marshal!" Amon declared to him from his right. "The Wyvern rider from Raver!" But he ignored him. His body vibrated as he charged away. He charged past the rows of tents and growing mounds of the dead towards the prisoner corrals. 2 Thardan lieutenants and 23 random infantry had survived the battle. They knelt in the mud, separated, bound, blindfolded, and gagged. Winslow acknowledged him with the rest of the watch as Lana walked past him into the officer's presence. With a swift kick, he sent the nearest prisoner careening to the ground. The marshal let his act sit for a moment before making his statement. "I'm gonna play a game here," Lano barked. "The first person to talk gets a gold sovereign and gets to walk away with their life. The second person to talk lives. Everyone else dies badly. I want troop locations. I want plans." The other Thardan lieutenant turned to him as if intending to say something. Lano cut him off briskly, socking him in the face and sending him to the ground. "Oh, don't talk yet, you officer bastards! We're gonna see what your infantry got first." Lano stalked off to the other pen, where more guards stood their watch. He made the same offer to them before turning back towards his small command tent. The rain continued to fall around him as he marched through the growing mud. Maps needed to be reviewed. Plans needed to be made. The prisoners needed time alone to let the threat of his words sink in. He hoped 2 of them would actually talk, but he didn't know. Brushing away the flap on his small tent, he sat on the cot within it as the glow-shard lantern burned overhead. A small table stood before him on the dirt, with map and sundries. The guilt within him continued to burn, even as he pushed fiercely back against it. He thought of his second, of the dead, and how he had led them into it. He just hadn't expected so few to wreak such havoc. For a while, he just stared at the space in front of him, eyes open but not seeing, not saying anything. He wanted to hide, to disappear for a little, but he knew that he couldn't. He was exhausted and feeling each aching parcel of that burden for the first time. The march and the task remained. Lano startled at the presence standing outside his tent. The pilot stood with metal cap and slit goggles around his neck. The leathers he wore were dirty, gashed, and patched. His face held the marks of long battle, eyes full of exhaustion, cheeks somewhat sunken. The Wyvern rider of Raver eyed him solemnly. "You know now what we've been fighting for the last 5 months," he said. Lano snorted at the apparent jab and deflected. "It was a brave thing you did. Probably more than a few of my troops owe you their life." The Wyvern rider nodded. "Your scouts are very robust. Don't act like most scouts I've seen. They pulled some Thardan infiltrators off of me. Just wanted to return the favor." The mercenary marshal looked him over thoughtfully. "What's a soldier of Raver doing this far east?" he asked. "Looking for you, actually, and being pursued since practically the beginning." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a letter, the seal of Raver still secure along its folds. "For you." Lano took it in his hands and opened it, reading the words written there. They were brief and to the point. The Ironwood patron had headed south from Bedded Thorn with an army of 3,000. In the midst of his transit, a Thardan detachment of some 10,000 had discovered him. He had fled to the fort city of Toln and was trapped there. Thardis' main force was being held at bay, but it wouldn't last long. Roland demanded that he arrive with all speed. The marshal cast an eye towards the messenger. "The matron Seraphina promised us 5,000. That's a number that can do something," he said. "I saw less than 3,000 soldiers before the battle. How many do you have left?" He didn't know for sure, but about 1,500. Maybe even a little less. "Enough to be worth 5,000, Lano growled. The pilot sighed with exhaustion and nodded. "Whatever it is," he said with a grimace, "we need it." The rider turned and began to walk away, before stopping himself. "There is something. If it's worth anything," he began. "I didn't expect to find you this far west. Roland wouldn't have either." "Where did you expect to find us?" He shrugged. "Somewhere around Darren's Landing?" Lano did some quick math in his head. "That means we're 3 days ahead of expectation." The Wyvern rider looked up at the sky. "I can feel the fall rains. They're only going to get worse. It's more like 7 or 8, if at all." He continued to walk away. "What's your name, soldier?" Belying his beaten armor and tired eyes, the Wyvern rider still turned with a crisp, practiced motion, struck his fist to his chest, and proudly bowed. "Lead flyer Marcus Rye of the 4th Aerial Squadron of Raver, or what's left of it." There was still fight in that soldier, in spite of all the long months that Raver had stood alone against this warlord. Lana wondered whether that was a reflection of the strength of the individual, or the royal that led him. As the Wyvern rider disappeared among his shifting troops, Lana wondered again what kind of man was Roland, the Ironwood patron. The marshal sighed as he turned to the small table, the map and sundries. He sat alone in his tent with his thoughts. The harsh reality of his situation slowly began to sink in as he stared into the space in front of him. 1,500 to break a siege of 10,000. It would have been bad enough with 2,500. What by rancor was he supposed to do? Triple pay was nothing against what lay before him. The matron Serafina may not have known it, but she'd commissioned him to be the savior of a fucking continent. He was just a mercenary. He was a tired mercenary. He was just a damn tired mercenary. He wanted to quit in a way that he never had before. That strange light in his heart stirred again. Foreign, but real. He wanted it gone, but the feeling persisted in spite of it. It was a larger cause than coin, but far less trustworthy. There was pride for certain. Once a job was taken, his army had always followed through to its end. This was some complicated mess of the things he had always known, and some great wealth of foreign territory. He couldn't just be taking coin and orders from wretched royals. He had to develop his own schemes. Lano turned from the map on the table to the prisoner pens, some couple hundred strides away from his tent. He wondered what they would tell him, if anything. If the Ironwood patron thought he was 8 days away, then maybe this scorched imperator thought the same thing. In the silence of his tent, he realized how much he missed Hannah's banter, and her counsel. It calmed him, and always seemed to help clear his head. The fall rains continued with a pitter-patter against his tent. His army buried their dead in the gaining mud. The border of Raver was less than 20 leagues away, with Toln barely another 15. Lano sat alone in his tent, thinking, while deep in his heart, among such feelings a mercenary was not supposed to have, he knew the answer. What remained to be seen was how he was going to do it. As the rain continued to fall on his tent, the plain exhaustion of the last day and beyond it fell over him like an avalanche. He'd only gotten some couple hours of rest in the last day, and he had fought 2 battles in that time. Practically before he realized what it was, and certainly before he could rally a defense against it, the marshal was asleep. He would rest for the day. He would let his army rest for a day beyond it. During that time, he was going to sort out the remains of what was left. Maybe his other lieutenants would have something to offer. The choice and circumstances were big enough, such that it was something he could not do alone. It was many further days in his past now, sitting still in the chair of his quarters, as the matron's deep sapphire eyes stared at him with impotent fire. "If you don't want to be part of this now," the matron growled, "you'll be my enemy later." Lano gestured to the far end of the wall with a shrug. "The door's over there, matron. Providence knows I wouldn't dare to lay a hand on you now," he said calmly. "But maybe the scorched imperator would be interested in my services as he conquers everything eastward." The anger radiating off of her was palpable. Lano drew a measure of pleasure from the act. It was clear enough to him that she wasn't used to being told no, especially from someone who wasn't a royal. What was she trying to hide? Lano wanted to know that as she stared him down, and he patiently stared back at her. "Your Clearwater spears have a stone-solid reputation," she relented at last. "You've never failed me in our dealings. You never run. That's very rare. Do you think you can do this?" Lano nodded to her. "Yes, but can and will are 2 different things," he replied with a gesture westward. "How bad is it out there? I'm not making a move without the details that I want. She stared at him for a very long time, silently, her brow furrowed for a blink as she hesitated. The mercenary marshal was keenly aware of the tell, perhaps the first real one. With a sigh, she reached into a hidden breast pocket and drew out a letter. Your precious details, she rumbled. About as much as I know. She handed it to him before turning towards the window. Lano spied the broken seal of Raver's crest before taking it in his hands and reading the information there. Written in Roland's hand, the Ironwood patron talked about the fall of cities. He talked of some small victories. He talked about faltering supplies. The descriptions were not overly done, cold statements of a seasoned warrior, until near the end of it. I don't easily ask for this, his words said. But imagine the worst it could be, and it is so. Without aid, we're lost. I'm not good with words. I never have been. I'm sorry for the distance I've kept from you for so many years. But I need your help. Yours and any other nation you can raise. We'll hold as long as we can, but I don't believe we'll make it to the winter. No, I will die on this hill before I see Raver fall. Know that I've always loved you, and that I will love you to my last breath. His quarters were quiet then. The matron still turned towards the window. Lano sat up in his chair with an eye towards her. Theirs was a whispered story, a tragedy never confirmed. Intense, forbidden love, pursued, found, and then abandoned for political gains. Two great rulers bore hearts for each other, but bound themselves to other royals. The scandal in this letter was undeniable. Raver has a reputation, too. The matron Seraphina began without turning. The Ironwood patron, Roland, has a reputation. It's not too different from yours. What a manipulative bastard, he snorted. The matron grimaced. Maybe. It doesn't make anything that was said before less true. I've always meant to unite the patronages. Unification has always had its benefits. And here's the opportunity. There was softness in her voice for the first time. The high pride in her shoulders slumped some small but noticeable measure. She was exposing herself to him, but not in the overdone kind of way that made a sane person wonder whether they were being manipulated. Lana realized then that she loved this man, genuinely loved him. Why would she reveal something like this to him? I'm not the only mercenary band you've propositioned, am I? He asked. The matron shook her head slowly. 3 other competent bands between here and you listened less and like the stones to tell me no properly. You're the last good mercenary army before the Crescent. Lano looked at her solemnly. The whole business made sense to him now. 4 times our normal rate, he offered. And you have the Clearwater spears. All 2,500 of us. The high pride of her shoulders lifted again as fire rose in her voice. You won't see a thin copper more from me. Take the price, take the job, or burn. Lano cast an eye to the door and then back at the matron Seraphina. He sat in his chair thoughtfully as perhaps the most powerful remaining ruler on the continent eyed him warily. The job was shit, and he knew it, even at triple, especially with all the information she'd given him. Everything seemed worse than he thought it was. He understood completely why the other mercenaries had turned her down. She'd been open with him, though, given up that leverage, however small. A proud royal stood in the privacy of his quarters, acting so unlike what he expected, acting like a real living being. The fire crackled between them as the matron remained silent. He wanted to say no to her, but something in his heart stirred against saying it. Lano didn't quite understand what it was. It was unique enough to mean something. He nodded slowly as he at last rose from his chair and approached her. The matron startled as he extended a hand out towards her. I won't piss in a honey pot. Triple will be equal to the task. he said. I'll have the detachment escort you to the crescent. You have the support of the Clearwater spears. The matron looked him over carefully, casting a doubtful eye to the hand offered towards her. You haven't asked whether I love him back. She clearly did, but it was a tender secret, a cause that Lana could believe, even if he didn't agree with it. He handed the letter back to her. And I won't, he replied calmly. The light touch of a grin graced her face for the first time. A moment further she reached towards his hand, gripped firmly and shook it. The deal was made. The mercenary marshal was committed. This might be the start of a great relationship, Lano of the Clearwater Spears, she said. Do me a favor and try not to die. He let his guarded mask fall as a burgeoning grin graced his face. He even afforded himself a little chuckle. He liked this woman. She was a royal unlike any he'd ever dealt with. It was something he'd never realized in their brief exchanges in the past. She just might be someone he would tolerate following. It was time to see how the high stakes fell, but it was also time to plan. Lana knew his troops would follow his orders in the end. But without real commitment, he couldn't be sure they would succeed. It was the evening of the following day. The dead had been buried, the wounded were tended to, and his army had been reorganized around the realities of its diminished numbers. Back in the present, Lano sat down with his 5 lieutenants in a cordoned-off corner of the healer's pavilion. The rain outside had subsided for the moment to a drizzle, as a solitary glow-shard lantern cast its light overhead. Beyond the watch guards and the roving patrols, the rest of his army had gone to rest for the night. Of the 5 lieutenants, 2 were new to the circle, one to replace a casualty and the other a demotion. The marshal cast his attention over Eero, Dennis, Jaska, and Urja. They sat on the ground before him with muddied cloaks and wary eyes, as Hannah lay bandaged up in a cot behind them. Winslow gave an awkward, if almost embarrassed, glance around the circle, having replaced one of the former lieutenants. A foreboding atmosphere pervaded the quiet evening, as the rows of wounded and sleeping soldiers stretched into the shadows behind them. Everyone was silent for the first moments, seemingly caught within their own thoughts. Urja was the first to speak, turning her head to the underside of the pavilion. Is it wise to have this meeting among the wounded? She asked. The whole army will find out soon enough, the marshal replied, sitting on the ground cross-legged with them. My concerns are with the immediate problem. I'm not dying, Lano. Hannah cut in. He could have moved me. There was bravado in her words, but the weakness of her voice said another story. Lano pulled the missive given to him from his breast pocket, detailing the situation in raver. This was passed to me from the Wyvern rider, he said as he handed it over to the 3rd lieutenant at his right. I want you all to read it. The marshal waited patiently as the letter passed to each hand of his officers, and they looked over the words written upon it. The message was not very long, but the details were clear of the grim situation they faced. As the last officer read the note, she passed it back to Hannah, who cast it back to her dismissively. All of them turned pensive eyes out and around the circle, wondering who would talk first. We're in a hard situation. I know it, Lano began. We currently have about 1,600 able-bodied soldiers. 1,600 against 10,000 is suicide. But there is somewhere we can get about 2,000 more soldiers. The Wyvern rider didn't know about it, but those prisoners certainly did. Where? Urja asked. About 4 leagues upriver from Tolm. There's a detachment of Raver soldiers waiting. Eero sat with crossed arms and snorted. I take it there's another catch? Lano nodded. About 1,000 Thardan soldiers are holding them to a hill. They aren't moving because they're too few to do anything about Toln, and they don't know we exist. Dennis, his 4th lieutenant, cast a thoughtful eye over the others. He made an inquiring turn to Lano. Words passed around the camp that we're at least 6 days ahead of when anyone expects us. Is that true? Lano nodded again. We should have surprise on our side. If we do this, I fully intend to take advantage of it. We clear the hill, we take in the Raver soldiers, and we fast march the 4 leagues to Toln into an even greater battle. Eero's combative posture barely shifted. He rocked his body with vibrant energy to and fro, casting a crooked eye to the map between them. That only puts us at 3-1 in numbers, even if we take minimal casualties. With the 3,000 trapped at Toln, Urja offered. It's more like 2-1. Eero scoffed. It assumes everything goes according to plan. War never goes according to plan. I stand by 3-1 numbers. The space went silent, each of Lano's officers going into their own thoughts. Eero's point was sound, and Lano knew it. He looked over those in the circle patiently, giving his soldiers time to take in what he had given to them. Eero leaned back against the ground with a clear look of agitation on his face. Danish and Urja sat crouched in their own thoughtful worlds. Jalska was the youngest in the group, the other one promoted to fill the death of his lieutenant. Fear and uncertainty spread clear as day across the young man's face. Winslow seemed like the only outlier. He lounged back with arms crossed, taking on a posture of impatient indifference. The marshal wondered what was running through that promoted watch sergeant's mind. At that moment, Dennis broke the silence. "So why aren't we cutting our losses and heading back?" he asked. "We avenged ourselves on those Thardan bastards. What's our fight in this beyond coin?" Urja nodded agreement as she turned towards him. "What's different about this one, Marshal?" "We aren't supporting some skirmish over a small piece of territory," he began, as a touch of fire rose in his voice. "We've all heard what this scorched imperator is doing. If Raver falls, Karul falls, all the eastern nations fall. The matron means to bring them together, not into some short alliance, but something that will last." "Unification?" Jaska whispered with a touch of awe, almost afraid to even say the word. Lano nodded. "Don't fall to childish dreaming just yet, Jaska," Dennis groaned. "It's bad enough they expect us to be the savers of Akartan first." The marshal turned solemnly to the circle of attending lieutenants. "The matron Seraphina propositioned 3 other mercenary bands. We were the only takers. The way I see it, we have 3 choices. We're saviors, we're martyrs, or we're just like everyone else. I don't care to be a savior, but it's better than a martyr. And we are not just like everyone else." Ever defiant, Eero scoffed. "Every damn royal talks about unification. They were talking about it since before I was born. How is this any different? Still sounds like a fancy cast to the wind, Marshal." "Then mutiny, Eero," Hannah cut in from her cot. The stern bluntness of her voice was so uncharacteristic that it caused all the other lieutenants to turn towards her. The circle went silent again. His lieutenants went back to their apprehensions. In spite of everything the marshal had offered, the mood had not improved. Lano turned his attention to the promoted watch sergeant across from him. "Winslow, you've been silent the whole time," he began. "What are your thoughts?" "Marshal, I'm just a sergeant," he said, with a touch of embarrassment. "Yet you promoted me to lieutenant for some reason. I don't know if I belong here." "If I didn't think you belonged, I wouldn't have promoted you, Winslow. Speak your mind." He shrugged. "You've thrown yourself into danger for us, over and over. You always do. I've been in other armies, and you're the only one who's done that by reflex. As you said, I'm not a craven. Tell me what to fight, and I'll fight it. It's that simple." Lano heard Eero groan as doubt flashed across his face. He sat up in a huff as he bent a thoughtful head down at the grimace. Danish and Urja did the same, perhaps with less theatrics. Winslow's words were straight and to the point, as ever they were, but the marshal could see they made a difference. Lano's heart stirred at the statement. This was a compliment by one who rarely gave it, and it was one he could believe. I support this. Not like I have a bone in this fight anymore, Hannah said from her cot. Can all of you leave me now and let me get some rest? Urja turned to her with a mild grin. You'll always be fighting with us, Hannah, no matter how far away you are. Try to warm my heart more, Urja, she groaned. The hero's eyes remained fixed on the Marshal, unfazed. We could still be martyrs, Marshal, he argued. We could be a lot of things, Winslow growled, finding his voice. But what we are is the Clearwater Spears. Ain't gonna have that respect if we run. And we could be something better, Lano added. It's a hard task, I won't deny that, but it's not suicidal. We can win this, but I do need your commitment to it. Maybe we can negotiate higher pay after the job's done, Urja said. That would make this ramming less painful. Lano cast a disbelieving eye to her. Would you truly trust a royal to pay more after the job's done? I wouldn't trust a royal with my half-eaten meal, she replied. That's why I became a mercenary. Dennis chuckled. You've always been straight with us, Marshal. No matter how bad it is. No flowery words, no horse shit. That does mean something. You have my commitment. Me too, Urja said with her own nod. To wherever it leads. Winslow and Jaska both offered agreement. Lano turned to the last holdout. Hero? The lieutenant cast a crooked stare at him skeptically. Do I truly have a choice? He asked. Lano shrugged. You can mutiny. Hardly a choice, he scoffed, before issuing a long sigh and turning solemn. I trust you, Marshal. Might be the most foolish thing I ever do, but I trust you. Count me a Clearwater Spear. Lano nodded soberly. His lieutenants were committed. The argument had been made, and the first obstacle had been overcome. By his estimations, there were 3 more that remained. Even if the first 2 were solved without error, it would still be 5,500 soldiers fighting against 10,000. He needed surprise on his side, and he knew it. Even then, Lana wondered whether it would be enough. All right, you misbegotten harridans. We're done here. Leave me be to rest, Hannah said in the closest she could manage to a strong voice. He turned to his assembled lieutenants. Get your things and units together tonight. We break down camp and depart in the morning. Aye, Marshal. They replied before filing quietly out. Alone with his second in his cordoned-off corner, Lano released a long, exhausted sigh. His eyes strayed towards Hannah, and she offered him a reassuring grin. How are you so cheery? He asked. This fight isn't mine, Lano, she replied with a weak chuckle. The Arden Majors may have done me a favor. How are you so brave all the time? Lano hesitated for a moment. His attention shifted about the medical pavilion as he listened for any stirring or words. Satisfied in the silence, he whispered a reply only his second would hear. I'm not, Hannah. I just keep going. A soft grin spread wide across her face. Fool a lot of us, she replied soberly. I'm cheery because you do that. We succeed because you do that. The Marshal stood up and responded with a touch of his own grin. He would do everything in his power to see them through this. The task before them was hard and uncertain, but ever was war in its purest state. This truth remained. Blood would be paid for blood. Win or lose, no one would forget the name of the Clearwater Spears.
And welcome back. Hope you enjoyed the story. Hope there were a little bit of a surprises there. I hope that a lot of the military procedural things kind of made sense. Because communication being pretty much nigh impossible when you're dealing with thousands of people. So a lot of communication being passed with horns. I hope my magic system, the introduction of the Wyverns, kind of were a a good addition that develops the standard fantasy expectations that kind of come with such things. I want to put out there that the sound integration is takes almost as long as the writing itself. It's ridiculous. I hate doing fighting scenes because there's so many layers. If I showed you the masters on it, it would be ridiculous because there is just I don't know, 10 layers of different sounds kind of going in to get a good, believable and immersive battle scene kind of going. Coming up next will be the final battle and the lead into the final battle. Hopefully some other surprises forthcoming, and still some good art and some good music and everything else. Not sure when it's gonna come out, but we'll see it. I have a life and a job, so I gotta negotiate that sort of things. And having said that, time to move on to the artists. We have 7 artists in this there and 3 musicians right now, and so without further ado, we're gonna move on to that right now. First on the list is this guy, and that is Adrianorizza. He has an Instagram. You can find him at adrianorizza.art at Instagram, and an ArtStation as well. That's adrianorizza.artstation.com. Great guy, one of the first people that I encountered who was really talented and at a price point that I could afford, and really kind of set the bar for my expectation of the other artists that I could encounter and work with moving forward, and I'm glad to work with him. He's currently busy as hell right now, and justifiably so. And but if I get a chance to, I'd gladly do some more work with him moving forward. Next up on the list is another one of my regulars. That's going to be ATMRLV_art. You can find him on Fiverr and Instagram with the same name. He did this stuff. Art student out of Russia. Really pleasant to work with. He's got his own busyness things, but you should check him out on Instagram. His stuff has got this cool fun, fancy feeling to it, and I'm trying to give him art that sort of plays to those similar feelings like that. We'll kind of see how that goes moving forward. And so that's what I got there. Number 3 on the list is the main placard artist, so this dude. And his name is joanbelda. You can find him at Fiverr and on Instagram. And on Instagram he is j.bm.88 at Instagram. Good, Art Nouveau kind of art, and simple enough to work with. I can't. He's good. I don't have anything really, standing out or negative to really say in regard to him. 4th on the list is this guy. And that is going to be varyson. He has an Instagram at varyson.art at instagram.com, and you can also find him out on Fiverr. Really talented artist, really undercharges for the amount of talent that he brings to the table, but I think he's trying to develop his portfolio. Not very talkative, and I'll acknowledge that, but he does listen, so if you give input, he might not acknowledge it, but he will, you'll see those changes brought out in, the art moving forward. So don't forget to, always request revisions, because that's part and parcel of what, the process is of working with other artists. Number 5 on the list is going to be virgiliocalzadi, or at least that's his name on Fiverr. His contact info on Instagram is edgargomez at instagram.com. He did this work right here, which I think is really, really talented, really good for doing the horror side of things. Unfortunately, I tried to commission him to do another piece of art, and he kind of ghosted me. He did ghost me. Thankfully, no money exchanged hands, so, be that as it may. He is good. I just don't know if I'm ever going to really use him again. But, hey, it is what it is. But I do like, this one piece of work that he did for me in general. So, that's what I kind of have on the matter, and that one at least went out without a hitch. So yeah, moving on. Number 6 is the guy who did this piece of work for me, and that is JamesSchutton. I hope I pronounced that right. He's out of the UK. He has an Instagram. It is, bear with me on this, stitching_a_laugh_2_darkness at Instagram.com. Really nice artist. I love his ink work. It's very reminiscent of some old-timey like horror art sort of things. And if I have other horror kind of art things, I gladly go back to him. He's been very accommodating, and like I said, I just really like his art style. So it's not on that end. Number 7's on the list is someone that you already know. Is the guy who did the map for me of Carton. That is SNIKT5. He's out on Fiverr. He's a professional. If you need an art for a kind of like a fantasy map or something like that, go check him out. He's totally worth it. Moving on, we have the musicians, and I'm going to try to get this right here because I don't think I ever give musicians enough time to give them an example that works. So number 1 on the list is going to be Rayanuk. You can find him out on Fiverr, and he did this. Definitely one of my favorite musicians that I've kind of done work with. There have actually been a couple of musicians that I've done work with where I'm not going to use their music. I mean, I paid them, but it is, there's good and there's bad anywhere that you kind of go. So I'll pass that one out there. But Rayanuk is amazing. Last I checked, he's still on like sabbatical or something like that. And so like working with him is not kind of like seems like it's out of the area for the present moment. But whenever he comes back, I'd love to get 1 or 2 other songs out of him. He's been really accommodating. His quality is amazing, and I will gladly use him again for sure. Second on the list is probably the most common musician, the guy who did this and this. And that is the Vicken. He also has Instagram. It's the Vicken Studios at Instagram. He's not one person. They are a music recording group out of Argentina, much like the third and final person that's coming up to this. Fantastic customer service. Definitely solid, good talent, and there's a reason that he's been like my most used musician because he's just so damn reliable, and being reliable and consistent is such a valuable quality, and I can really stress that. So if you like his music and if you like the samplings that you've kind of heard on here, by all means, like, use him. I only wish the best for him, frankly. And then moving on to number 3, that's the main theme here, which should be playing in the background and everything else that's going here, so I don't need to stop for a second or anything like that. And that is Franco_Donadio. He has a SoundCloud at Franco-Donadio, and he's also out of Argentina. Great jazz musician. I was looking for something that was kind of like Haitian fight song, and the guy delivered in spades. And it's got a good upbeat, good high energy, and it's just the sort of thing that I love to have at the opening and the closing of any kind of story. So yeah, that kind of covers everybody. And once again, if you like my content, please like, comment, subscribe. Tell me what you thought about the story. Tell me if you liked it. Tell me if you didn't. My stuff doesn't really get better if I don't get any kind of good, constructive criticism. But that's really all I got on that end. And to that end, salute, and have a wonderful day. Alright, I swear I'm gonna get better at this like 2 or 3 times here, I always forget. I have an Instagram, you can contact me at Instagram. It's Pablo Americanas at Instagram. I am not going back to re-record the epilogue here because that thing is a goddamn pain in the ass. But if you want to shoot me a message directly, you can contact me on Instagram. I mean, no one really has, but I'm open to any other possibilities. I really don't have anything else up there, but it's a great way to get a hold of me. So, I hope you enjoy, and I hope you enjoy the story, and I'll see you in part 3, because it will come when it comes. And if you listen this far, you're a weirdo, but hey, God bless you on it, so